take the logical steps, build a buffer, build your platform, and then start to, build your wealth strategy on top of that.
Welcome to 360 Money Matters, where financial planners Billy and Andrew talk all things financial planning. This podcast aims to increase your knowledge and confidence with all things money. Each week, they will cover topics like wealth creation strategies, investment principles, creating passive income, paying off your debt faster, and much, much more, so you can live a life on your terms without limits.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the 360 Money Matters podcast. I'm Billy and I'm joined by my co-host.
Andrew, Bills, here we are back again, back in the recording studio.
Andrew, we say that every time, but where else do we record this from?
Well, exactly right. We say it every time because we're in the recording studio every time.
The recording studio, which is a meeting room essentially. But this is a different meeting room. Not that people would be able to tell because the background's the same colour.
No, different colour background. Background.
Yeah, okay. Got you. Andrew, what are we talking to everybody about today?
Bring us back from that tangent. We are having a little chat today about, people that are taking a career break. So if you are taking a career break, how do you actually manage your finances through that? What are some of the considerations? And ultimately, how do you manage it?
Yeah, so we'll talk about, some of the financial considerations and impacts and the things that, it's I guess most of it should be pretty obvious, but for those people who are going through this, it could be a good opportunity to sort of pulse check your thinking around, okay, have I considered this or have I considered that, or have I missed anything that I should be thinking about in terms of, the impact of what a career break could be. And I guess it's probably fair to call out that there's a career break where, you've driven and made that decision, or there's a career break in terms of maybe it was not necessarily thrust upon you, but it could be redundancy. A business that you're working for has closed down. It could be that, you're starting a family. I guess a couple of different things there, but ultimately there's an impact to your financial situation. Andrew, where do we start? Why do people take career breaks?
Look, you've already, covered a fair few of them. I think parental leave is probably one of the most common ones.
Yep.
And I know that that's covered, in some instances by an element of government pay, but, still managing that, still considering other things that you may not have considered, like missed superannuation payments, all of that stuff is still relevant. But people take it for any number of other reasons. Burnt out, need a break, people taking a sabbatical. Traveling is a really common one. So people deciding to go traveling overseas, whether that's a working holiday or just purely an extended break, taking, a different trajectory in terms of your career path, which may mean that, you need to either work part-time or stop working so that you can study, caring responsibilities, elderly parents, all of that stuff. So, every single one of these is going to have their own financial implications and a different way to ultimately be, or to ultimately manage it. And essentially what we want to talk about is, hey, what are, potentially some of the things that you can consider over that time as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good lead in, Andrew, to what we're going to talk about next. So if you're planning a break, so if you know that there's going to be a gap in employment for whatever those reasons are, so I just want to call that out. If it's planned and you know that it's happening, you can do something about it in preparation for it. It's also just as important to give consideration to career breaks that are unplanned and unexpected. So we might, like I said before, you get made redundant from a job and it might take a little bit of time to get into something new, or a parent or a sibling or a loved one or a child, what have you, needs some care. So I think this, even though we're talking about, hey, plan for it, and it comes across as we're saying, in the instance that it's a known event that's going to happen, in the same breath, we're also saying plan for the unexpected because it applies across both scenarios. So I think the first one is really factoring in how much money that you should have before you have that break, before you step away. What does that look like? Taking into consideration living costs, one-off expenses, unexpected setbacks, interest rates, increasing cost of living. And ultimately what that comes down to, and we talk to people about this when we're setting when we're going through the cash flow program with them, is talking about how much is their spend rate or their burn rate each and every month. So saying, okay, if you then say my burn rate is X, and let's use a figure of $10,000 as an example. If $10,000 is your number, normally what we do when we're planning cash flow is you've got the income to offset it.
Yep.
Where in this instance, if we're assuming that income goes down to zero, I mean, you were talking about maybe things like government support and bits and pieces. We might talk about a little bit like that down the track. But, okay, how much money should you have is based on a whole range of circumstances. We'll get into that in a sec. But essentially, I think that's the first thing that you have to think about is how much money should I have? And then as a consequence of that, or as an offshoot or an outworking of that, it's like, okay, what do I need to do in order to get that into that position to then be able to take this time away, knowing that financially I'm going to be okay.
Yeah, exactly right. And everyone's going to be different. So depending on your circumstances, how much you need is going to depend on, do you have dependents? Do you not have dependents? What's the security of income in terms of maybe, one person working while the other person isn't working? Do you have, is your mortgage balance all the way up here or is it down here? So depending on your personal circumstances will depend what your financial buffer ultimately should be. But if you can factor it in and you know that there's going to be a career break at a certain point in time, well, then you want to factor that into your calculations ultimately. And you want to make sure that, if you're going to take 12 months off work, for argument's sake, make sure that your minimum amount that you have in there is covering that, plus a little bit of a buffer on top of it as well.
Yep. One of the easy ones from my perspective to call out, and, this is well publicised and well known, taking time out of the workforce. What's the longer term ramifications, assuming that you're working for somebody and receiving super payments, super guarantee contributions from your employer? Even though it may represent a short period of time over a working career, say it's 12 months because you've taken time out to raise a child or what have you, what's the impact when you take a year's worth of contributions and compound those over a working career? What's the impact from a superannuation strategy from that perspective? Look, the answer is, depending on your time frame and how much you earn, it can be quite significant and substantial. I think that's well known. Andrew, what do we do about that in that position?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting point because I think that what you need to determine is it psychological or is it actual? And what I mean by that is if someone has a, let's say, superannuation balance that's higher than another person in a family relationship, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an issue, because the way that we tend to view assets, particularly when you're talking to a family group, is a combined superannuation balance. However, if someone is older than the other person, is going to have access to superannuation earlier, then it's a consideration. But, you can look at things like spouse contributions, like government co-contributions into super, or going back to what we were talking about earlier, is plan for it earlier. You know that, potentially one person in a relationship is going to have, or you're a single and you know that you're going to have a career break for a period of time. So, okay, let's add some salary sacrifice contribution to super 12 months before you decide to have that career break in order to be able to offset, the 12 months afterwards, which there isn't going to be any contributions, is, one of the examples around what you can do to try and help manage that period of time.
Yeah, and look, the other thing to call out here is catch-up contributions as well too. So if there's a gap, being able to make that up down the track, depending on your circumstances, is potentially something that's open. So you may not necessarily lose the ability to contribute in terms of the time frame. It might take you a year or two to be able to catch those up, but there is some mechanisms in place if that's the case, but definitely something to take into consideration. And what we talk to people about is modelling the impact of that and going, okay, are we going to be okay? Or is it something that we should pay attention to? Because realistically, at this point in time, like we're going to talk about in a sec, is you've got competing priorities. You've got all of these expenses and you may have reduced your income source to zero and you're just relying on savings or investments to be able to get you through essentially. So that probably brings me on to the next one around what do we do and what do we think about things like insurance costs. specifically things like income protection. We'll talk a little bit about that in a sec. Do we pause those premiums? How long can we pause them for? Do we cancel them to try and reduce the impact on our cash flow? And what are some of the ramifications as well too? Because we've got a point in time where we've got all of these expenses, and naturally, if your income goes down, I think it's quite natural to turn around and say, okay, where do we start to cut things out? Where do we turn things off? And that's a really low-hanging piece of fruit. But Andrew, what should we think about when doing that? Should we be turning our income protection off? What do we need to think about?
Yeah, I mean, look, income protection is a really interesting one because obviously if you're without an income, there isn't an income to protect. Or on the flip side, you've got an income protection policy that covers you for a benefit amount of, up here, let's say it's $10,000 a month, and you're working part-time and you're only earning $5,000 a month. What do? Do you reduce that income protection benefit down? And I think that the consideration, or one of the biggest considerations, is what's the likely outcome moving forward? Now, is it likely that your income is going to increase in 12 months' time and going to return to normal? Well, then one of the considerations might be if you decrease cover and then you go to apply for it again, you need to decrease in cover. There's no underwriting, there's no medical questions, there's no financial questions, there's no questions around your occupation. So doesn't matter what happens with your circumstances if you're decreasing cover. But anytime that you go to increase cover, all of a sudden you need to answer all of those questions again. And if something has changed, it might preclude you from getting cover in the future, or you might have exclusions or loadings or whatnot. So you really need to strongly consider before you decide to make the call that, hey, I'm going to reduce cover. And I think that one of the perfect examples is, when someone's going on maternity leave or parental leave, one of the questions is, okay, do we, stop income protection and then look to restart it if you're taking 12 months off? You consider all of the potential medical ramifications that can happen during childbirth. And all of a sudden, the question is, okay, well, if there are any complications, is that going to potentially give us exclusions in the future? And are we cancelling something that we're not going to be able to get back? So, as Billy alluded, putting a pause on cover, and this is different with every policy. So not every insurer, not every policy is going to allow a pause. But a lot of income protection policies, particularly policies that we consider, will allow you to put a pause on premiums, restart it back again in X period of time. Again, it depends on the insurers to how long you can do that for, to help offset the cost of cover, but not lose the benefit of having that cover in place at that point in time as well.
Yeah, really something from that perspective, because it is so critical.
Just get advice.
Is get advice around it. But our starting position whenever we're talking about this is retain it and then start to tick off those things that we were talking about and those considerations, and whether or not there's a high degree of probability that you can get it back at least at the same rate or conditions as what you've currently got. As opposed to it being, you're going for it again and it being a position that's been deteriorated because, you're now 10 years older than when you originally made the application and they take into consideration all of your medical history and things like that. So, I guess tread with caution with that one because it's not as simple like other insurances where you see, the direct debit coming out each month and you go, okay, I'm just going to turn it off and then I'll go and turn it back on down the track. It's not as simple as that.
Yeah.
Governments, payments, Centrelink, eligibility, paid parental leave, study allowances, job seeker, different types of, it's a whole minefield within itself. There's a lot of information out there and it's quite good information, but there's a lot of it. So getting an understanding of what's available from a government support perspective is definitely one thing. But the second thing too is getting an understanding of the eligibility criteria to make sure that what you think you're eligible for is you're going to get. Because you may be aware that these certain things are out there to be able to get access to, but most of the time there's an eligibility criteria to be eligible. And if you don't, if you're expecting a certain level of government support and then all of a sudden you go through the application process and you're not receiving that, it can be quite detrimental to your financial position as well too. So that's definitely worth spending the time to make sure that what you think you're going to get is what you're going to get. And it's just as equally as important knowing as opposed to the knowing part, as opposed to just the money coming in, because the money coming in is great, but knowing that the money is not going to come in is also critically important with your planning as well too, because that then changes how you prepare for it as well.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I think, one step is making sure that you're not missing out on any support programs that could be available that you're not actually claiming on. And, to further allude to the point that Billy was making is if you're not going to be eligible, look at it beforehand. One, so that you can plan, to not receive that income. But two, there may be things that you can do, to shift your assets around to make sure that you are eligible if you're prepared in advance and if you know that something is ultimately going to happen. So looking at that in advance, I think is definitely a great point on that. Investment contributions, Bills.
To invest or not to invest? That is the question.
What do you do?
Well, look, ultimately it's a trade-off between your financial position and meeting the needs of today. And it's probably no different to any other investing conversation, but meeting the needs of today or meeting the future needs of you down the track. I guess stating the obvious, it's always going to, 99% of the time, always going to be better if you continue to invest. So stick with your strategy. We've spoken about that till the cows come home on the podcast previously. If you can continue doing that, dollar cost averaging, you keep that going, it's just part and parcel of what you do. I don't personally think for most of the situations that I've seen that you should stop. If you plan for it and you've got enough financial resources to be able to keep doing it, you definitely keep doing it. Sort of thinking of the flip side of that, there are instances where people have created investments because they know that they're going to have, it might be a sabbatical, it might be time off. They've always wanted to go and travel 6 months, a year, whatever it may be. So the investment was designed for that specific purpose in mind. Then obviously that's a different approach and that's a different strategy. But if we're just talking about investment purposes for the sake of wealth creation, if you're in a financial position to continue doing that, I think that's a sound approach, simply because you're taking advantage of continuous contributions, dollar cost averaging, and you're keeping up that discipline. And I think that's critically important for your future wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, one of the things that I really like to ultimately consider in all of this is what happens when you do return to work. So generally speaking, most people, while you decide to take a career break, your expenditure naturally goes down because you're not seeing that income coming in, you're drawing down on savings or investments, and in essence, you're either forced in a position or psychologically you feel like, okay, I need to, not spend money as freely as what I ultimately would do. For me, what this represents is an opportunity when you do return to work and you do start to get that income coming in to say, okay, well, I've been living off X income. My lifestyle hasn't been impacted. I'm not any less happy. So great, let's maintain that. Let's set the floor at that lower level and use this, reduced income as a, resetting of what the floor ultimately is in order to be able to, okay, income's now come back in, and that discrepancy between your income coming in and your expenses coming out, while that might have been a lot smaller while you were working and in the midst of things, and now you've got a much bigger discrepancy, and then capture that surplus income and utilize that as a springboard to move forward as well.
It's amazing how that happens when we see it play out in real life, that reset, because it's quite interesting. You might be in a position and you go, okay, there's not much that I can do. But when you're forced to do something, it makes you reimagine and rethink sort of what's possible. And in that instance, I guess that's a positive lever. And you go, okay, we were living off this. Now we're living off that because I've returned to work or whatever it may be. The income's coming back in again. Do we need to increase our spending? That reminds me of a similar time to during COVID. When we think about our household expenses, at least us personally, you couldn't go out. You could still spend money, but you couldn't go out. So your expenditure for us anyway was less. once all of that was gone, it's like saying, okay, do we need to go back to that and do all that? Probably not. We survived. We enjoyed ourselves. We found other stuff to do. Perfect example of that as well too. So,
yeah.
So returning to work, what are the things that we think about other than the resetting, specifically about rebuilding quickly to where we were? I mean, there's some fundamental pieces to it. Budget.
Yeah.
Rehash your budget, get that up and running again.
Capture that surplus income, rebuild, rebuild savings. I mean, you talk about that initial cash flow buffer, or that initial buffer that you would have had in your account around unexpected expenses. A lot of the time that's been diminished. Build that back up again. You really want to build the foundations before you start to, aggressively chase wealth creation.
Mm-hmm.
So rebuild those foundations. And then, a lot of the times people can just feel like, my buffer's really low, but, I've taken 6 months or a year off or paused contributions. Let's just start anyway, which can lead to, incorrect decision-making, because all of a sudden an unexpected expense comes. You either rely on debt or you rely on, liquidating assets, which is not what you ultimately want to be doing. So take the logical steps, build a buffer, build your platform, and then start to, build your wealth strategy on top of that.
Yeah, I think they're all valuable points. One thing I want to add as well too that I tend to observe when this happens is revisiting your goals, because you tend to find after a really big life event, one of two things happen. You can't wait to get back into life as it was, or it's an opportunity where it's been a really pivotal moment for you where you say, okay, I've gone and experienced something different. I've reflected on my life beforehand. I want the future to look different.
Yeah.
So your goals may change. So I think it's also a good opportunity to revisit those just in case there's something different and some tweaking of your strategy that you need, because that will help formulate sort of what your return to work looks like. You're thinking around your finances and you go forward position from that perspective. So that's a really big one that I tend to observe. Andrew, tax planning considerations?
Yeah. I mean, look, while you're off work, or while you're not receiving an income, your taxable income is obviously, either at zero or very low. So consider, you've got an investment that you were always planning to sell, but the capital gains was too large. Maybe it's, hey, let's, liquidate that investment over that period of time. Maybe it's, hey, I'm going to make some super contributions over that period, but I don't want to make it at a point in time where my taxable income is zero and I'm going to get no tax deduction. So let's put it into a savings account. And then when I return to work or before I take time off work, let's, put the super contributions in to maximize the tax efficiency of it. I think that generally with all of this, what you want to be considering is the tax implications of making a contribution or doing something either before or after, and the tax deductibility of it when you're planning for something like this. The other consideration is taking advantage of the point in time where your taxable income is zero while you're off work in order to potentially, offload assets that you've always wanted to offload. However, the capital gains and tax implications have been too large.
Yep, really common strategy. And probably the last one to end on, which is, we could probably do a podcast on this one within itself. And personally, I've experienced this as well too, but the emotional impact and the identity shift that happens when your income decreases or goes to zero. The psychological impact, you might be used to the independence associated with that. You might have been working since you were young. You could be the predominant income earner in a family, whole range of different things, but it affects so many areas. Some people feel guilty. Some people lose confidence. Some people are experiencing pressure. And that can even happen even if you've got a plan. Like I think back to when we had our children and we were planning for it financially and stuff, but that was a really difficult time. For me in particular, my wife didn't seem to have an issue with it, but for me in particular, always looking at things like our savings and our investments, even though we had built them up in order to support us during that time, just watching them either go sideways or deplete was very challenging for me. Even though that was the plan and that was the intention, I didn't want that to happen. And I felt very uncomfortable with it because that's kind of the unnatural state for me.
Yeah. And I feel like that's a role that you can play, and having that open communication between your partner, but also your financial advisor.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when we're talking to clients, you start to almost feel like you're part of a family, or you're part of a household at a point in time. And speaking to someone and having someone unbiased from the outside to reassure you and remind you that, hey, we were planning for this exact scenario, and to a certain extent, this was also experienced when we went through, interest rates rising at the rate that they did. What we saw with a lot of clients was, I'm used to my savings continuing to increase every single year. It's, stayed flat or it's gone backwards. I'm panicking, I'm stressing, and having that conversation or having someone there to be able to say, hey, this is why we built those buffers. We built those buffers in order to be able to account for unexpected events like this. We've built assets to be able to potentially liquidate and, cover these periods of time. So there's a strategy behind this. Your normal life is full of ups and downs and everything in between, and yet people tend to think that their financial life is linear, and you grew your wealth by 5% last year or 10% last year, then you're going to do the same thing this year and the year after, and it's going to compound. It doesn't work like that. So having someone there to be able to remind you that this is all part of the strategy and this is the reason that we're doing it, I think it definitely can be helpful in these periods as well.
Having a crack at me there, Andrew, because of that's what I was thinking and it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly right.
Andrew, I reckon that just about sums up everything that we wanted to get across today to our listeners and our viewers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that definitely covers it off. So, Bills, thanks again for another great podcast. Thanks to our listeners and our viewers. If you got some value out of that, like, subscribe, share, and details for Billy and myself are in the show notes if you wanted to reach out as well. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening today. If you have any questions on what we talked about or would like to have a chat about your money journey, visit us at 360fs.com.au.
The information in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or needs. It is not financial, legal, or tax advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should consider whether the information is appropriate to your circumstances and seek professional advice before acting on any of the information provided. Past performance is not a reliable indicator of future performance. This information is provided by Billy Amiridis and Andrew Nicolaou of 360 Financial Strategists Pty Ltd, authorized representatives and credit representatives of Akumin Financial Planning Pty Ltd.